I have never seen a character so much chaos in such a short amount of time. Okay, brief disclaimer actually, before we get into the actual meat of the story. This episode is going to be about 5 sessions, all kind of bundled together into one recap. This is partly to help me catch the series up with where the campaign is, but I also think more than that, these 5 episodes really work well together and kind of make their own little standalone arc, sort of sandwiched between Coombe and Throkus Cradle. For these 5 episodes, we were joined by a guest NPC. Michaela, Steven's girlfriend, popped into the campaign for a few sessions as Dredgar Bracebow, a brand new member of the Menagerie and an unforgettable guest star. So let's quick meet Dredgar, and then we'll dive right into the story. Dredgar Bracebow is a dwarf of Clan Bracebow, one of Dunya's allies in her war against the dragons of Coombe. He's a siege engineer, one of the dozen that joined Kosava Bracebow, the artificer, and the Scorpion, the massive siege weapon that she designed for the company when they left Coombe. Dredgar is a buffoon. He's clumsy, he's awkward, he's always putting his foot in his mouth. He's Kosava's favorite nephew, but he never really wanted to be a siege engineer. His dirty secret is that he always wanted to be a chef. When Michaela reached out to me, she specifically said she wanted to play like an uncool character. So just imagine a huge dweeb in this party of hardened mercenary killers. Okay, I think that's everything. So let's catch you up. The Menagerie sails for Throkus Cradle, the homeland of Umber's ancient orcish father and the site of their next contract. To do this, they must cross the breadth of Ondune, beginning in the frozen gigantic ocean aboard the ice merchanter Unity. Unfortunately, there is immediately trouble in paradise, because the Unity's captain, the gruff Captain Zachary, is a former lover of Umber's, much to Dunya's dismay and annoyance. As they sail, we meet Dredgar Bracebow and his immediate supervisor, Yazram Bracebow. Another dwarf of the clan, Yazram is Kosava's second-in-command, but has a dim opinion of his subordinate. What's more, we learn that Yazram knows something about Dredgar, something about an avalanche, something that Dredgar doesn't want Kosava to find out about. And this is a fact that Yazram exploits to his advantage. The company's first stop is the frost giant port of Tva Harbors, where giants heft enormous ships from the water, carry them across a land bridge, and deposit them in the opposite ocean. Here, the company resupplies, recruits, and books passage further south. Along the way, Umber meets one of the company's newborns, the screaming orc babe Banshee, and he reflects on how, as the son of a Throck, or an orcish leader, he lives much longer than most orcs do. A starstruck Dredgar, meanwhile, meets Dunya for the first time and offers her a handmade meat pie that he cooked for her, and which she, politely, eats. The Menagerie's next stop is the half-orc riverport of Onsk, famous for its Glimmer Scale Run, where millions of fish swim upriver to spawn. Once again, they resupply, they recruit, and they seek passage, but this time for 2 ships instead of 1. In an attempt to double their profits, the Menagerie is splitting their forces, sending half their number to accept a contract on the western frontier of the Outer Limits, while the other half travels to Throkus Cradle to accept Umber's father's contract. While searching for passage to Aros, Griffin runs into an old friend, Osgar of Kincan, first mate of Zelene Silvers, the pirate that they owe a favor to from all those months ago. And what do you know? Turns out she needs a favor. Crossing the Draconic Ocean toward the hidden pirate port, the company reunites with another old friend, recruited in Onsk. Unicorn is back. A former mercenary, a notorious card sharp, and now a reformed paladin of the halfling canon of saints, Unicorn has a history among the Menagerie, and Remoraz, for one, is not pleased to see him. The pirate rendezvous is a volcanic island called Disaster, the site of an ancient explosion that annihilated the local colony. Here they meet Zelene Silvers and quickly get the skinny on her favor. She wants a stronghold to stash her ill-gotten booty, and she wants the Menagerie to conquer it for her. She's chosen Fort Yarakir, claimed by the undead during the Night Wars, and the subject of 100 ghost stories. The company insists on negotiating a fair price, whatever treasure they find in the belly of the fort, but ultimately they agree. Dunya, however, is less than pleased to discover that Zelene Silvers is yet another of Umber's lovers, and the two have a big blowout about her expectations of life as a mercenary. Dredgar, meanwhile, gets into rather more trouble. While preparing a meal on the island's beach, he is surprised by Yazram and accidentally cuts his finger. Yazram pays no attention to this and instead gives Dredgar a vial of milky white liquid, telling him to add it to the next meal that he cooks for Dunya. When Dredgar objects, Yazram pressures him about the avalanche until he reluctantly agrees. When Umber later asks Dredgar about his wounded finger, he says nothing about the poison, but instead concocts a wild story about how Zelene's pirates attacked him. The more the Dredgar doubles down on this lie, however, the more it gets blown out of proportion until it threatens to swallow the entire island in a violent bloodbath between pirate and mercenary. It's Griffin who ultimately discerns the truth, that Dredgar lied and lied and lied to save face, and he gives Dredgar a stern warning. Sailing to Fort Yarakir, Unicorn reconnects with Commander Chimera, and it is strongly hinted that the two have a romantic past. Griffin, meanwhile, attempts to regain some trust amongst the company, but instead he butts heads with Hook, a goblin mercenary and the company's resident malcontent. Arriving at Fort Yarakir, the company must navigate the misty shoals that encircle the island. They manage to avoid wrecking on the reefs, but are harried the entire time by undead screams, suggesting the presence of a banshee. Concocting a plan of attack, the Menagerie splits their forces, assailing the main gate with their army, while the commander's tent, including Dredgar at Umber's insistence, sneaks into the fort through a hidden back entrance. Inside, they indeed do battle with the banshee and the skeleton garrison that she commands. It's Unicorn who smites the creature into oblivion with divine radiance before it could drain all of Umber's youth. Victory is swift and certain. In the aftermath of the battle, Griffin searches the fort and uncovers a small fortune in ancient coins. Umber and Unicorn see to the dead, while Remoraz, thinking of the Night Wars, burns the undead with the rest of the company's veterans. Dredgar, meanwhile, got into more trouble. Anxious to commence with his poisoning plot, Yazram continued to pressure Dredgar, but he, in turn, hatched his own poisoning plan. Rather than go to the company with any of this, Dredgar invited Yazram to discuss it with him over dinner and plotted to poison Yazram instead. After applying the poison, a deadly tincture called Mother's Worry, to a sweet roll, Dredgar attempted to fool Yazram into eating it. When the poison's distinctive smell tipped Yazram off, Dredgar had no choice but to attack him, and the two fell into a deadly struggle. In the end, Yazram force-fed Dredgar his own poison sweet roll, and in a moment, the lethal toxin claimed Dredgar's life, but not before he screamed for help. Interrogated by the commander's tent, Yazram's story, that Dredgar resented him, attempted to poison him, nearly holds up, considering Dredgar's history of deceiving the company. Under pressure, though, Yazram cracked and confessed his plot, his distaste for Dunya and her abandonment of her country, and how little he cared for the company he signed up to work for. The Menagerie was forced to decide what to do with him. Was this self-defense? Was it premeditated murder? What does the contract say? While Griffin and Umber favored execution, Unicorn and Remoraz found rare agreement in advocating for banishment, especially once they learned how much his death would devastate Kosava and neutralize their siege engineer unit. This was the ultimate that Chimera found most persuasive, and ultimately she decided to spare Yazram and exile him from the company. Justice for Dredgar? Not everyone in the company thought so. And that's where we are. Like I say, truly a remarkable cameo. Dredgar only appeared for 4 sessions, but sowed so much chaos in their wake. Michaela didn't attend the 5th session, but it was literally all about untangling this crazy web of lies. I think the big takeaway is that none of this would have happened if Dredgar had just come to the party and confessed and said, this is what Yazram wants me to do. Right? There were like pressures and reasons not to, but Michaela seemed so determined to just drive the character off a cliff. And it should be noted that she was laughing. We were all laughing the whole time. It was this like incredible like goofball comedy thing that had this tragic ending. There was a joke about how we would eventually have to come up with Dredgar's like, Menagerie name. All the members of the Menagerie have names that are based on different animals or monsters. Mouse, Remoraz, Umber, Hulk, Griffin, things like that. But Dredgar died before we needed to do that. The poison was something I invented, never really thinking that it would get used because I assumed that Dredgar would take this very obvious poisoning plot to the party and they would just, prosecute Yazram. But the conceit with it was that it dealt constitution damage, right? So it was very, very deadly, slowly kind of chipping away your constitution. And if you rolled badly, which I did, it could kill you in a matter of rounds. I find a lot of poisons in D&D are kind of weak in that way, where it's like, oh, this deals a little poison damage to you. But if you want like a poisoning plot that kills someone, you've got to use something a little bit more efficacious than that. I've been meaning to work Michaela into the campaign for a while, but could never really find the right time. This felt like a good opportunity as we were transitioning from Coombe to Thruckus Cradle, and I knew I wanted to call in the Celine Silver's favor from all the way back in the first contract. And so I liked the idea of kind of folding these two things together. We would go on a little mini quest and take over this fort and do this fight with this Banshee and kind of reconnect with Celine, especially because that would throw Umber's relationship with Dunya into question, right? Because we didn't mention this, but Umber has slept with 2 of the 3 captains they've sailed with, Zachary of the Unity and Zeline of the Silver Saber. I thought what a great way to introduce Dredgar, especially because Michaela wanted to play a dwarf, and we had just recruited these new dwarves to run the siege engineers, and I thought that was a fun confluence of things. This needs to be pointed out too, Dredgar has a penalty to charisma. And so the fact that Dredgar could like string them along in these lies, they rolled like 3 or 4 natural 20s. And so people just kept believing it, even characters who really should know better. And that was a big part of the appeal of the character, was that they were just stumbling, literally by dumb luck, into these scenarios. The session with the fort went pretty normal. They fight the encounter they plan, they use their troops, all of that was great. But then once we got into the kind of aftermath session, that's when the poisoning really came to a head. That was kind of the whole ethical discussion of that last episode that I really liked. The initial conceit was to present the characters with, someone who essentially breaks the Articles of Agreement, right? Like, what is the company's disciplinary policy if another mercenary does something like this? And I didn't know, and I wanted to put that to them. But I had never anticipated it being so convoluted. There's a reasonable case that Yazram was acting in self-defense. Like, yes, he had plotted to poison Dunya, right? But he never actually acted on it. He gave the poison to Dredgar, and Dredgar, who ostensibly was complicit, even if he's being blackmailed, he didn't go to the company. Dredgar also has like a huge history of lying, so there's a reason not to trust Dredgar about any of this. And it's this credible thing of like, is conspiracy to poison somebody against the contract? These are mercenaries, and they're only governed by this sheet of paper that they sign. So a big part of the drama of that final episode was saying like, what do we do here? There was a whole scene where they put it to the company to ask what the company thought, and that's where the idea of like Kosava and her emotional attachment to Yazram and to Dredgar would come in, that like Dredgar was dead and there's something that could be done about that. But if Yazram was also executed, it was just going to demoralize Kosava to the point where the siege engineers weren't going to function as a unit anymore. She is really the linchpin in their whole unit of siege engineers, and they really want this siege engine for this upcoming contract. So the threat of, hey, if we kill Yazram, that's going to devastate our kind of like genius artificer and make it much harder to use this unit. That was kind of what ended up convincing them, but of course, that's not going to convince everybody in the company. I'm playing with some themes of dissent and of insubordination that we're going to talk about in a little bit, but that was a nice way to kind of lead into that and feed the fires. Hook, the goblin character that I mentioned, kind of was the voice of that opposition again. Whenever I need someone to be a whiny little shit, it's going to be Hook in this arc, which is fun. Umber and Dunya are kind of a big plot point for I think the first half of this contract. Stephen really liked the idea of kind of falling for this queen, but Umber has never been in a relationship that lasted more than like a couple of weeks. And so it's a lot of the kind of the pitfalls of their relationship. There were even more scenes that I didn't allude to in the recap of them kind of like butting heads and trying to figure each other out. There've been a couple of scenes between Stephen and I that are very much just like, marriage story kind of arguments, which are really interesting. I've never done that in Dungeons and Dragons before, played out that level of relationship, and it's interesting. There's also a plotline I'm playing with about Griffin and his trust among the company. Griffin is kind of poised to be the person who inherits the Menagerie after Chimera retires, which he's talking about doing. It's kind of hovering in the air. Last arc, at the end of the Coombe arc, he confessed that Yorgos was his father, and he made a big speech about it, but he rolled very badly on the speech. And so we're kind of playing with this idea that there are people in the company who like resent the kind of nepotism and the favoritism that Umber and Griffin get. They kind of externalize that on Griffin, who is the child of these 2 different mercenary commanders, Yorgos of Nair, the commander of the Iron Word, and Chimera, the commander of the Menagerie. Right? And so he's kind of playing with this idea of, does the company trust me? Can I be trusted? Can I regain their trust? And Hook, who I mentioned, is kind of the externalization of that resistance to him, right? And sees him as, mama's boy who just gets whatever he wants. So we're hinting at that. There'll be a lot more of that to come. I feel like Grimoire has kind of got the short shrift in the initial recap last episode because so many of the other characters' plots personal plots kind of affected the main story. Remorhaz has a lot going on, but it just didn't really impact the overall narrative that much. There's a lot of personal stuff, but it's not as effective. Right now, Remorhaz is struggling with redefining who they are. They have put aside for this arc their shoulder blade, the sword of the Vayudarya that defined who they were. They're trying to discover who they are without that sword. So Hallie's kind of playing with the idea that maybe Remorhaz becomes an archer for this arc and is kind of practicing doing some ranged fighting, right? If you remove that fighting style from Remorhaz, who are they now? And so that's kind of one thing we're dealing with in this moment is that, like, how do you make the character functional in a fight while still basically having them learn a new fighting style? There's a lot about Remorhaz that we're going to probably tuck into another episode because it wasn't super important here in the Dredgar arc, but there's lots more going on with them, so stay tuned. And then lastly, I want to talk about Unicorn. Unicorn is Kate's new character. After Mouse retired, they wanted to play someone kind of different that had different energy, and we liked the idea of, that sort of gangster movie trope of, like, the guy who gets out of prison and then comes back and everything's changed, right? This is someone who served with the company on a previous contract, left for a while, went home, got married, retired, and then for some reason, when the company is kind of passing nearby, rejoins with them again. He's a paladin, and Kate is really kind of playing with this sort of like Western, Timothy Oliphant in Deadwood kind of a vibe. But there's some interesting character stuff with him and gambling and drinking and smoking and stuff like that. The idea is that he used to be kind of a high roller, a reprobate. And now he's reformed. He's a paladin of the common canon, which is the kind of like halfling pantheon of saints. I think the original pitch for Unicorn was kind of like that annoying like yoga instructor who's always like, oh man, you just gotta like let your core go, you can tell how much I don't know about yoga. You just gotta like, breathe through it, like that kind of stuff, right? He's like obnoxious about it. So yeah, that was the arc. That was the tragic tale of Dredgar. We are sailing on towards the contract of Throkus Cradle. We are playing tonight. So I can't wait to see how the party sort of deals with the aftermath of Yazram's exile, and there's some Zaleen stuff I have cooked up, and then we're going to be heading into Oros, and this new contract in this new world. But I'm curious, what punishment do you think that Yazram deserved? Do you think he should have been fined, exiled, executed? Where do you land on that spectrum? Who do you agree with amongst the company? I regret to inform you that the subscribe button has been poisoned, so don't be like Dredgar, and make sure that you ring that bell to warn the rest of the company. As always, this episode is made possible by my patrons, so if you want to see more videos like this, consider joining the Patreon. But until then, thank you for watching, and happy adventuring.